Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the past, present, and future of asset management. I'm Anna Soslova. I'm part of the marketing team here at Axonius. In today's webinar, Patrick Kelly, VP at Axonius, will take you on a trip through time to uncover how analyzing the past, including understanding the intersection of devices, cloud instances, users, and solutions, dictates how we approach cybersecurity challenges today. Before I hand it over to Patrick, I wanted to remind our audience that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it after the presentation. You'll also receive a link to the recording shortly after the webinar wraps up. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to post them in the Q&A or chat section on your screens within the Zoom platform. Lastly, if you're an IC2 member and stay for the full duration of the webinar, you'll earn a CP credit. If you didn't fill in your IC2 member ID when you registered, please email it to me as soon as possible to anna@axonius.com and I'll be sure to add it. And with that intro, thank you, Patrick, for being here today, and I'll pass it over to you to get started.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Patrick Kelly. Good afternoon. Really want to start off by saying thank you to all of you for joining us and sharing your time with us for this whirlwind tour through the past, the present, and the future of this very exciting topic of asset management. Predicting the future is really hard, isn't it? I mean, this is something I've thought about a lot. If you think about 2020, who would have predicted any one of a series of wild events that we saw in the last year? And unless you were Nostradamus, no one guessed anything close to that, right? I mean, it was just something that nobody expected or saw coming. And speaking of that, if we're trying to understand, the future, things like cybersecurity challenges, just 10 years from now out into the future, a great place to start is asset management. And the reason why is, what are you trying to secure? Your whole security program is all geared around and based around securing information and securing your assets. And so, before we get into what the future might look like and really how we might predict some of the things that we have to think about, I think it's helpful and beneficial for us to take a look at the past, how we've evolved to the present and some of the present conditions. And then I think maybe we can make some predictions about the future. And so, much like the movie Back to the Future, if you think about it, events of the past are really very much interconnected with the present and ultimately the future. Any one change, as we saw in the movie, in the past really reverberates into the present and can really have an impact on any particular thing in the future. So understanding how we've evolved from the very first physical devices and networks, right, to the latest cloud and IoT platforms may help us understand how to think about the future in terms of asset management. And so we'll start with the past in terms of the device management. And I really like this slide because it takes me all the way back to my college days. I'm pretty old, getting pretty old up in the age here, because this was really kind of the scene back when I was in college, and everybody was dying to get a spot in one of these rooms, and most people were wanting to be there to write their English paper or their history paper, and this was really the only place to get to a word processor, right? And some people did, of course, show up to play games like Minesweeper, but most people were there to work. And these were these were the days before iPhones, right? This was the days before cloud containers. Very simple days. You actually went to a physical building to work. You actually interacted with physical humanoids, and you sat in front of these big clunky monitors that were connected to usually a big white box. And we can't see it under those tables, but those are connected to a bunch of big white boxes, right? And where it was connected to the network, those networks were very simple. They were very flat. Most of these machines, or the machines that we dealt with those days, were pretty much all Windows. Might have seen some Macs here and there, right? So you're dealing with one operating system. And on these machines, you might have had a few applications, and pretty much everybody in that room was using the same printer, right? And I also like this slide, this clipboard, because I was actually this guy at one point in college. I did a bunch of odd jobs around the campus. I was an RA. I was actually a tutor in some of the subjects that I majored in. But I also worked for some extra money on the side in the IT department. And once every semester, a group of us would go around with these clipboards, and we'd go all over campus from building to building, floor to floor, room to room, and we were looking for really all the electronic devices in these rooms in these buildings. And so we had TVs, right? We had overhead projectors, if you can recall those, if you're old enough to remember. We had copiers, right? A few of those rooms would actually have a terminal, maybe a dumb terminal, et cetera. But most of these devices weren't even connected to a network, right? And we actually were not just looking for the count of the devices, we would actually go from device to device, and we were looking for the actual physical tag. And that physical tag, it was printed or stamped into a little piece of metal strip that would stick it onto the back of the machine, and we had to actually, quote unquote, correlate that to the serial number of whatever that device was. And so if you think about then, and that was just really 30 years ago, 35 years ago, times have changed. Everything's gotten smaller. Everything's starting to move much faster. And we have this explosion, or have had this explosion of devices, right? And so they started to multiply. We went from, kind of those Windows workstations to the interconnected networks, right? And then we started to see wireless access points show up, and then mobile devices started to enter into these environments. So lots of new platforms, lots of new operating systems, applications, and of course, we've got threats and we had a threat landscape we have to track. So security started to become part of this as well. It started off as an AV, and we've gotten more and more complex from that standpoint. So lots of complexity. And so with all this complexity, new challenges have arisen in the present day around the idea of device management. And so the first one really is this idea of knowing where all your devices are in the environment. And so if you think about it, we really don't have a data problem, but wait, we actually do have a data problem. The data problem that we have is that we have lots of asset information, but it's fragmented. It's siloed. It's in these different repositories or data sources, right? And the silos of data about our assets, they're all constantly changing. They're always getting updated with changes about those devices. And so if you want to get a complete picture and knowing where all your devices are, you really have to start to aggregate those silos into some consolidated platform, right? So that you can start to see the types of devices you might have. You've got mobile devices. They may be on the network, they may be off, they may be corporate owned, they may be BYOD. You probably have some laptops and tablets on the network, off the network. You certainly have virtual and physical and containers in a data center. Many customers have moved some of those compute resources, or many of them, to things like EC2s and storage buckets in the cloud. If you're like any of the corporations we walk into today, you probably have a wide sundry of unmanaged devices like printers and copiers and cameras. And then, of course, just your networking devices alone, right? Routers, switches, firewalls. If you're a large, complex organization with lots of locations, that in and of itself, the networking gear could be actually hard to know and track. Okay. So you've got this first problem, and it's a big problem. But even if you could get there and you knew all these devices, then you've got another problem. And that's what is running on these devices, right? It's not just knowing the device, it's knowing what's on it. And so you've got the operating system, might be Windows, might be Linux, it might be Mac, etc. You've got to worry about the version. You got to worry about the minor build, the major build. You got to worry about the patches. You got to worry about the software. You have to even worry about who's using that device, right? And so this second challenge is just as hard as the first one, because there's a lot of information. There's a lot of characteristics about these individual devices, and those characteristics are changing, and sometimes they're changing rapidly. You also then have to think about, how do you secure and how do you manage these devices, right? Some of them are unmanaged, and so part of management of unmanaged is just being able to know where they are, and if needed, know how to contain them if they're rogue devices. But for the managed devices you have out there, you still have a lot of work to do, right? You got antivirus agents. You might have endpoint detection and response agents. You might have mobile device management agents. You might have endpoint management agents. I walk into lots of corporations where they have maybe 2 or 3 endpoint management solutions because they're trying to get at certain pieces of information. They may have 1 to 3, maybe I've seen as many as 5 security agents on the device. And so you get this big stack of agents, right? And so it also comes down to, ensuring that you've got those everywhere they're supposed to be. That fourth problem is, once you kind of know all of that, it's, well, you got to manage the hygiene across it, right? And you got to manage it across disparate platforms. Patches and configuration and hardening are not easy to do. We all know that, there's a wealth of vulnerabilities out there. And I think the last time I saw a report on it, I think 52% of all the previously discovered or known vulnerabilities had not been patched. So we know patching is in and of itself a very difficult thing to do. And then, of course, what do you do about detecting potential issues? Well, there's lots of issues that could occur, right? You could have a broken agent. You could have a corrupted agent. Somebody's removed an agent. Maybe you don't have the agent. Maybe you've got vulnerabilities. Maybe you got open ports that shouldn't be there. So there's a sundry of different types of potential issues that you have to think about and track with regard to these assets. And then, even once you've found kind of the issues, you also have to worry about, what actions do I take? Who do I hand that off to, and how do I do it? How does it fit into my current workflow? And how does it fit into my current systems, right? Who do I send an email to? Do I tag the asset? Do I open a ticket? And if I open a ticket, which workflow do I use? And maybe I have more than one ticketing system. Do you need to scan the device? Do you need to rescan it? If you've solved some of your vulnerabilities, you may have to do a rescan. Do you disable a user on the device? So there's a lot to think about, a lot of challenges when it comes to the current day device management. And I apologize, I didn't fill out my slides here, or fill out my bullet points, but let's transition again back to the past. Let's talk a little bit about cloud assets. We've talked about devices, so let's talk a little bit about cloud, and let's go back in time. Let's start back, around 2000, and we'll start with Amazon. Back in 2000, Amazon was pretty much a bookseller, right? And they were trying to expand their horizons of what they were selling. And but as they were doing this, they started to run into a problem. They wanted to deliver more services. They wanted to be able to sell more products. But despite adding more people, they found that they couldn't build, or they weren't building their applications any faster. And so the big challenge that they ran into was something that many of us who are around my age again are probably familiar with. There was a time where we didn't have the ability to spin up virtual machines in the cloud, right? I remember going to rooms where people sat down and you actually wrote on a whiteboard, and you were actually trying to spec your servers. Do I need RAID 1? Do I need RAID 5? What kinds of drives do I need? How fast do we need those drives to spin? What type of memory? What types of chip settings? What types of processors do I need? And then there was the process of ordering all of that hardware and waiting for delivery. And so just that process alone sometimes took weeks or a month just to get the hardware in. And then, of course, the devices come in. Somebody's got to unpack those devices. Somebody has to check them into some type of inventory. Back in those days, some companies were still just using a spreadsheet for that inventory. You might have a team that installed the operating system and all the different tools that needed to be on the device. And of course, if you'll remember back around 2000, you still had to worry about drivers to make your peripherals work in some cases, right? Or certain aspects of applications. You might have a separate team doing your database, right? In your 3-tier architecture. You might have another team that you had to worry about, from a storage perspective. And so once you looked at kind of this timeline to actually architect a new server, for a new application, to deploy a new service, sometimes these things could take 2 to 3 to 4 months, right? And this was a really big challenge in 2000. And so, Amazon, before it became AWS, tried to solve this problem for themselves, right? And really what they were driving for, and they achieved, was this idea of being able to easily provision hardware or compute resources, right? Or these shared computing resources, I should say. And this idea was actually quite revolutionary at the time. And and it really changed the world forever, right? Because we got the concept of cloud computing out of this, which it evolved to, and it really come down to, how does software get developed, how does it get deployed, and how does it get distributed, right? It really helped Amazon increase the efficiency and development in their process. And as that started to matriculate into the market, we started to see companies, CIOs, CISOs, CFOs, they wanted to start discussing, how could they start to take advantage of the cloud? How could they migrate to the cloud? And what types of things would you move to the cloud? And if you look at, just last year alone, we went from, in 2009, a market where there was $59 billion of public cloud computing services in the market, to last year there's 257 billion, right? Of all of the respondents that are out there, 94% of corporations are using the cloud as of last year, and 83% of the enterprise workloads that are out there are today in the cloud, right? A huge chunk of IT budgets is now allocated, 30%, to cloud computing. And if you think about it, it makes a whole lot of sense, right? In those early days, you did go buy physical servers, you put them in a rack, right? And you had to worry about the depreciation schedule, and pretty quickly those compute resources were obsolete. They became obsolescent, right? The power of computing was moving too fast, and so this whole idea of moving to the cloud, right? It's simple economics, right? I want to spin up things. I only want to spin up the things I need. I want to spin them up when I need it. I only want to pay for what I use, and then when I'm done, I want to, kind of get rid of it. And that's kind of the economic scale, and it makes a whole lot of sense, right? And so, if you think about people thinking about moving to the cloud back in the early days, right? They had to decide on first, what was going to be the dependencies in that cloud, right? And they had a number of challenges that they had to overcome. So the first one was connectivity, right? If you think back just 10 years ago, the internet wasn't perfected in the way it is today, right? Access to the internet wasn't ubiquitous. If you went to different places, you might be able to get access. You might only have dial-up. You might only have ISDN. You might have, right? You might have a high speed at that time. And the speeds themselves could be a challenge, right? And so companies were reticent to put their mission critical applications in the cloud. And then the second one was ownership, right? It's really easy to understand ownership when it's your server, sitting in your office or in your building. And it's really easy to understand the ownership of that data. But when you start to move things into the cloud, right, the big questions 10 years ago was, well, who owns that data, right? Who's going to handle my backups? How am I going to handle my backups? How do I get access to those for me, to manage myself? And what about data loss when there's some type of problem? Somebody breaks in, if you have a disaster recovery situation, how is all that going to work? So these were big questions, just 10, 12 years ago. Then you had to think about stability, right? Compute resources cost a lot more 10, 12 years ago. And so when you looked at, things like server farms, right, where you'd have multiple servers as kind of in a pool of resources, you might not have as many. Load balancing technologies wasn't as mature as they are today. And even at the network layer, if you think about things like active, passive, high availability of network devices, or VERP, for how you route things when a device fails. A lot of that was just being worked out right around this time, 10 or 12 years ago. And then you think about regulation, right? The law of the day in those days were very clear. If you were dealing with your own server in your own building, you knew exactly where the data resided, and you knew exactly what laws applied. But putting things in the cloud at the time opened up a whole new Pandora's box of regulation. So where was that data going to end up? Was it going to be replicated? And when it ends up in different places, what types of regulations are you compelled to comply with? And all we have to do is look at something like GDPR to understand the complexity that brings to an organization. Just getting your arms around what your requirements are, not to mention what you need to do in response to it, right? And then, of course, in the past, security. It's always the biggest piece. I remember when companies, as they were starting to transition away from building their own servers and managing and hosting their own servers inside of their own buildings, they were starting to move to the cloud. The cloud was really, at that time, people putting their compute resources into a cage. And in many cases, the customer was left to design and deploy their own security controls into that cage. So you had to look at the routing, you had to look at where were you going to place your firewall and your IDS. You actually had to purchase those technologies and deploy them and figure out how to access them and manage them yourselves, right? Configurations, patching. This was not something that was really done by the cloud providers. And so these were challenges that people had to overcome as they thought about moving into the cloud. And so as we look back now, you can recall that companies were reluctant and they were kind of slow to move into the cloud. And they started to do so in a very piecemeal fashion. But eventually, obviously, the allure of lower costs, right? The ease of provisioning services really led to a faster adoption rate. And today, what's really interesting, if you look back, just in 10 years, everybody questioned, should I move to the cloud? Is that a good idea? Is it safe? How am I going to manage it? Today, nobody asks those questions. Today, the question that everybody's asking is, should I keep anything of infrastructure on my premise, right? Most people are really thinking about, how do I get rid of all of it and not have to own any of it? And so that brings us to this idea of the present, and some of the things that you have to think about and some of the challenges of cloud management, right? And so very similar to kind of on-premise device management, right? You again need to know where all of your devices are. And in the cloud, those devices could be a virtual machine. They could be containers, right? Workloads that are in the environment, but they can also be all kinds of other types of virtual devices. It could be a storage bucket, could be a load balancer, could be a NAT gateway. You have to really understand the environment in its whole, and that's not always easy to get your arms around. And if you're in multiple platforms, which I see most corporations are today, and those cloud platforms are all configured and managed a little bit differently. There's different naming conventions, right? There's different ways to deploy the same types of services. How do you get your arms around what you really have across multiple cloud environments, right? Then, of course, security. And it's not just security controls like getting an agent to a device. It's, well, who has access, right? Those identity and access management. What roles do people have? Are these devices internal facing? Are they external facing, right? Who has access to them? And even when you get down to the devices themselves, how are they configured? What type? Who's the admin on the device? And of course, the security controls themselves. Do I get an agent onto it? Is that agent configured properly? Do I have the right policy on that particular device? We move into pieces like vulnerabilities. We already talked about, the vulnerability management space, right? There's a huge proliferation of new vulnerabilities. How do you address those vulnerabilities? How do you even scan every device in the cloud if you're not sure of where they all are? The ephemeral nature of the devices in the cloud make it sometimes difficult to get a complete picture of the vulnerabilities on systems in any timely fashion, right? If you're scanning once a month across your cloud platform, you're going to miss a lot of devices that spring up, and maybe they're there for a little while and then they go away. The detecting of access and misconfigurations, right? That's a very hard thing to do when there's a lot of complexity, right? There's a lot of different systems. Complying with best practices, right? What are your best practices, and how do those best practices that were born in the world of on-premise, right, and physical devices, how do those get implemented, and who's implementing those best practices in the cloud, right? You may have one security team, your threat and vulnerability management team, doing vulnerability scans. You may have your security engineering team worried about getting agents or configuring the security agents. You may have a different team doing, like the server team doing the IT hygiene. So you have to really worry about all of these different workflows and best practices and how they fit into the cloud. And then last is, again, how do you take action when you've got a device that doesn't meet a control? How do you take action when something appears that maybe shouldn't be there? How do you take action, and what are those actions that you do take when you find something that is misconfigured or presents some type of security risk to the organization. And so those are some of the challenges that we typically see in the cloud. And I do apologize, I did not build out my bullets again here. But now we're going to transition a little bit over to IoT devices. And we're going to kind of go through a little bit of a timeline here, talk a little bit about the past and how we've evolved to today. We'll talk about some of the challenges of getting to today from an IoT perspective. And then we're going to start talking a little bit after that about the future. But I really think the IoT space is really interesting. 5 years ago, I didn't really think about this problem set, but now it's upon us, and it's rapidly accelerating. And if you think again, just 30 years ago, we had our first IoT device. A guy named John Romke. He was a founder of a company called FTP Software. He created a toaster that could be turned on and turned off over the internet. Introduced it at Interop conference in 1989, 1990, right? A couple guys at Cambridge University, right? They had a room called the Trojan Room in the computer lab, right? Security guys, obviously. And that Trojan Room, had a thing called the Trojan Room coffee pot. And what was really cool about it is that they were monitoring the coffee pot levels, and they would take an image of it every 3 times every minute, and they would send it to their server. Much later on, once browsers could actually display images, because 1993 that wasn't really common, they actually put those online for viewing. You look at 1994, Steve Mann, father of the wearable computing, created WearCam. And what's interesting about WearCam is if you actually go out to the website, wearcam.org is still a website that exists. And if you go to it, that page is pretty much just HTML. It is very much circa 1994 type of web page. And on that page, Steve actually said, in 1996, he shut it down basically due to poor internet speed and internet connection when he moved from one location to another. So that there right there tells you some of the challenges that you'd have with an internet connected device. 1998, Mark Weiser, was the CTO at the time of Xerox, constructed a water fountain outside of his office, right? And the fountain's flow and the height of the spouts, right, would mimic the volume and price trends of the stock market. And of course, this always brings up to me when I first learned about this one, it brought up very fond memories of the fountains at the Bellagio in Vegas. Pretty much most people are familiar with that. You see it in movies, or you've been there and you've seen it. Playing music and the water and the lights kind of tied in with the spouts of the water. 1999 is the first time we heard Internet of Things, right? IoT. Kevin Ashton came up with this term. In 2000, we saw the first internet connected refrigerator. LG put this out. And of course, since then, we've seen washers and dryers and ovens and a whole bunch of other home appliances, right? The ability to connect to those devices and understand when service and maintenance needs to be done on these devices, or those devices reporting back, some problem that they might have, has improved service levels using that IoT device. 2011, Gartner finally gets into the game, and they added IoT to their hype cycle, and this really generated a lot of the buzz. I don't think I ever heard IoT probably before Gartner started talking about it, and they made it kind of a commonplace, kind of name. In 2020 to this past year, 55% of the organizations out there have IoT projects. 83% of security professionals last year said that they believe IoT devices will outnumber all other devices within the next 2 to 3 years. And if you look out 10 years, Cisco predicts that there will be 500 billion connected IoT devices. Okay. And so what were some of the challenges early on, right? We just saw that kind of timeline, but there was a lot of challenges in there that had to be overcome for IoT to become such a mainstream part of our computing environments today. And so first was cost, right? Compute power, memory, processor used to be a lot more expensive. And so the average price for these sensors back in 2004 was $1.30. Today they're 40 cents, right? And that's really important. It's not so much for the actual generation or the build of these products or the buying of the product. What's really important is that most of these don't last for very long, right? They're kind of buy it, because they're cheap. You use them for a while. The average lifespan is typically less than a year, and so you have to really think about cost in terms of how often do you have to replace it, right? And so that was a critical component to getting IoT adoption. When you think about connectivity, right? IoT and the data they rely on, right, is all about connectivity. And so, as we noted in as I noted in the WearCam example, if you didn't have the right speeds and you didn't have the right connectivity, obviously you were going to have some challenges around your IoT devices. If you think about analytics, right? Data today, data is everything. Data is king, right? We rely on data, and the early sensors really just didn't produce a lot of data. And again, it was because of the computing resources being high cost, right? So they'd have minimal resources. And so the data that would come off of these devices in the early days weren't really meaningful, right? And because memory costs have reduced over time, it's allowed for more information to be generated. Of course, interoperability, right? If your sensors can't interoperate, if they can't communicate with other systems, they're siloed, people don't want to use them. And then the biggest one, for us right here at Axonius and our customers is this idea of securing them. Early sensors were really hard to secure. They still are, in fact. And if few developers would actually build in any type of security into those devices. And so compromise of those devices was actually relatively easy. And so, as we transition from kind of the past of IoT and managing those devices and the evolution, and we start to think about, today's age, right? Those IoT devices have become pretty widespread, right? They are what are bringing some of the biggest challenges today to IT teams and, of course, security. And so some of those, again, is a very common theme here, as you can see, understanding what IoT devices are in your environment. But it's not just understanding what devices are in your environment. It's really understanding how to categorize them. A lot of these IoT devices are very discrete in nature. They serve this, one single function. And so as you start to understand what you have in your environment, you really need to start asking yourself several questions, right? What is the device used for? And is it critical, right? What's the criticality of that system? Does it what happens if it breaks? What breaks inside my organization? What is the impact of these IoT devices? And again, we talked about the fact that they don't stick around very long, as far as because they are cheaply made. They are fragile to some degree. How long is it going to live? What's the lifespan of it? Because I got to know from a preparation and management perspective, how I'm going to handle workflow and replacement cycles, et cetera. And so those are some of the challenges. But once you know that these exist, how do you identify the new ones, right? Again, lots of new IoT devices are being created. There are things that I hear about, from week to week that I didn't hear about 6 months ago. So there's always these new and different types of IoT devices entering the environment. And so you have to identify what they are and still, again, go through that process of what are they there for? What's the criticality of them? And what impact do they have? And you also have to start monitoring, right, for things like risk, because many of these IoT devices are unmanaged. Your configuration items or options, excuse me, are sometimes very limited, and the options for securing them may not exist at all. I mean, we see often that customers have no way to really understand how to manage them or what the security ramifications of them are, because they're very much a black box, right? And again, because they're a black box, when you plug these into your environment, you may be walking yourself into some regulatory requirements, right? You don't necessarily always know what the device does. You don't necessarily always know how it functions under the hood. You don't always know what the security ramifications are. You might not know or have the ability to get any type of security on it. So it walks you into some regulatory questions depending on where it ends up in your environment and how it's being used. Of course, you have to think about this idea of the process of when they fail, right? How are you going to identify when they fail, right? They end up in very small places and networks. So reachability of those devices when they fail. How do you track when they fail? How do you understand the impact of that failure, and even better, how do you predict it? And then lastly is this idea, like our cloud and our device management discussion. How do you know when to take action, and how do you know what actions to take? Who's responsible for these devices, and how do you tie an event or some type of condition around one of these IoT devices to an IT system for things like alerting or ticketing? So these are all challenges that the IoT presents to you today. And so we've kind of covered the past and present challenges of cloud and physical devices and IoT devices. We'll talk a little bit now. We're going to transition to kind of the future of cybersecurity. And if there's one thing that we can be sure of, that the past and the present certainly helps inform us of, is that, we're always going to see constant change, right? New platforms, changes within platforms, new devices, changes to the devices themselves, new vulnerabilities, new threats. The only constant that we can be sure of is change, right? And what's really more important is not that we have to expect change, right? This idea that we have to embrace ambiguity, it's really that we have to start thinking about the rate of change. It's not just that there's going to be change, but the rate of change. How fast are computing resources changing? What devices and how fast are entering and leaving my environment? How fast are we spinning up virtual machines and containers and having those up and then back down? How fast are all of the characteristics on individual devices changing? And the reason why this is important is because if you're going to keep up with your inventory and have it, kind of up to date, especially for security practitioners who live in the real world of real-time alerts and triaging those alerts and events, you better have an inventory that you can reach into that's kind of that's caught up with, at least near real time to the changes in your environment. I think that we will look back 20 years from now, and even something like AWS, we may think of as kind of the rotary phone of its day, right? I mean, change could happen 20 years from now. AWS could appear like the rotary phone. Secondly, is discovery. It's not a one-time event, right? It's a process, and it's an ongoing process. It has to occur continuously, and it is because everything is changing. And so you've got to be able to capture that change, right? The ephemeral devices, the devices coming and going, the attributes and characteristics of the inventory changing so quickly that you have to be there doing it on a continuous basis. And you have to be able to do it quite frequently, right? And then there's this idea of continuous interrogation, right? So you found your inventory, you're keeping up with it. You see the change in the inventory, you see the change in your characteristics. Now you've got to continuously interrogate for the security conditions, right? You need to discover and constitute and reconstitute the inventory quite frequently. And that means you need to check and recheck all your security controls. I think about this, been security for a long time. I mean, literally, you have companies who've done a pen test and they're good, one day, and a week later they get penetrated. Something changed, right? You have an agent that's functioning on a device, and hours or days later, it's either corrupted, it's not reporting in, somebody's removed it, it's no longer functioning, right? Devices 1 minute could be internal facing behind lots of security controls. The next minute they could be out in the open, in the public IP space. You got devices that might have no vulnerabilities today or no exploitable vulnerabilities, and an hour later you've got exploitable vulnerabilities. So if you want to try to secure all of these assets that you have, you kind of got to be checking for all of the security conditions that are critical to these individual devices and your security controls. Then there comes up, the mapping of expectations, right, to action, right? You really need to define what conditions are important to you. Do I want to track EC2 instances that are public facing, that have a critical vulnerability and maybe are missing or have a broken security agent, right? That's probably a condition that you'd want to track. And as you think about tracking it, you're probably going to want to understand the level of protection. You're going to want to understand how you're going to mitigate that risk and how you're going to tie that to actual actions that people take, right? And as much as possible, you might want to try to also automate some of that action, right? Because our human staffs aren't getting larger as in terms of numbers, right? Budgets are always constrained, and so we're not always going to have the people resources that we need. And then kind of the last idea here is that, the thing that we can count on is that all the tools and devices are going to change, right? The compute platforms are going to change. The numbers and types of devices will change. The applications will change. The software that we put on it will change. You have a lot of customers who will move from one AV to another. They'll move from one EDR agent to another. There's always going to be change. There's going to be change even in the platforms you own, as far as the services that they provide, the way you communicate them, the information that's available to them. And so how we manage and secure the devices obviously must change as well. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation. We do have, but we have 3 ebooks that are available to you, a bundle of ebooks which dive into everything I've covered today in much more depth. And if there's anything that you've missed today, or that you want to explore in more depth, you can reach out to Anna, our host, and she can help you schedule a one-on-one demo, or she can sign you up for one of our monthly live platform overview. We do webinars, and really those are pretty in-depth. They're about 20 minutes tour of the platform, and you get a chance to see lots of use cases and ask lots of questions. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. I'll open it up now for some questions.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And thanks to everyone who already submitted a question. I just wanted to give our audience another reminder that if you have any questions for Patrick, feel free to pose them in the Q&A or the chat. So one of the questions that came in was, from a security perspective, could you please share some insights about the differences between using VMs as opposed to containers on private cloud? For example, how can we manage identity and access management, monitoring, et cetera?
Great question. So we tie into all the major cloud platforms that are out there. And if you have looked at all at AWS or Azure or GCP, they're actually quite robust in the API that they make available. And things like identity and access management roles are something that you can actually track and actually fetch and pull right out of the API for those particular platforms. When it comes to virtual machines, right? The virtual machine, you've got physical machines in the cloud, and on those, they're stacking up lots of virtual machines. And then within those virtual machines, they're carving up compute resources into workloads, right? Those ECS and EKS containers, Kubernetes, et cetera. And so within a platform like Axonius, we can pull all of those different containers, and we get all the device IDs and the operating systems and the version they're on, et cetera. We get that straight from the infrastructure. It's available in the API. We can correlate those together, right? We can correlate the virtual machines with the containers that are running as workloads on them. So really, it just comes down to the ability to connect into and authenticate to those particular platforms and pick and choose and decide what you want to pull out of them for whatever you want to track and monitor.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in, and we had a similar one during our EMEA session this morning, is how do you think cybersecurity will evolve in light of the pandemic? What are some of the ways CISOs are preparing to adapt when and if people do return to work in the office?
Yeah, so it's not a future, it's a here and now. We talk to CISOs every day. Major changes occurred, obviously, with the pandemic. People stopped going to offices. And so the first challenge was for many organizations, how do I enable a remote workforce? We saw lots of companies caught off guard with things like VPNs, not having enough licensing for the number of people that were now working from home. We saw folks that didn't have a lot of two-factor authentication, that they had to quickly roll those things out. But even Once those challenges were solved, a whole bevy of other challenges now, present themselves. Folks who used to work in an office with maybe a management agent, and that management agent would look for peers on their network. There's no longer a bunch of peers on a local network, right, so to speak, because people are working from home. So we've seen impact of things like their management agents taking up a lot of compute resources. We had a lot of CISOs ask us really quickly for how do you manage and track users? How do you manage and track user attributes? And a lot of folks will have a password. I'll give you an example. A lot of people have a password change policy that's 30, 60, or 90 days. And when they moved everybody off out of the offices, some people might not actually log into the network and authenticate to the domain controller for long periods of time. And so there was this idea that they needed to look. We had one customer that needed to us to help them produce a list of everybody who had a password change coming up in the next 30 days so that they could avert any problems, right? They actually wanted to take action proactively to push out the password change date further down. They basically wanted to kick the can down the road. So we've also got CISOs that are telling us, a lot of, it's not just the laptop that left, right? A lot of people came into the office, grabbed all their peripherals and USBs and all kinds of other things, right? Those things weren't easily trackable, and they're not even sure if those things will come back. So yes, you've got a lot of problems occurred with the pandemic, and I think they're here to stay. Right? We already knew that the remote workforce was growing. Pandemic, COVID has done nothing but accelerate it. Many CISOs I talk to say that corporations aren't planning to bring back everybody back to offices. We probably can expect that the workforce will remain remote and mobile, and maybe never coming to the office, or very infrequently. And so that impacts other things like, did you buy a NAC solution to track devices on the network? And you deployed that into one of your offices or many of your offices, and those users now never even come into the office. So now you don't even have the NAC to maybe track some of those users when when they're connecting, for example, from their home office to a cloud resources. Maybe they never go through the NAC. So there are a lot of things that have to be thought out in terms of security and in terms of assets.
Great. And then another question that came in is, I always hear from a dozen vendors that they'll give me full visibility into every device, but I already have a bunch of different tools. Isn't that good enough?
Yeah, so this is one of the most common things that I hear, right? I walk into 20 new customer prospects every week, and they say to me, "Well, I've got a vulnerability scanning tool, and that produces asset information. I've got a NAC on the network. I can see assets, right? I've got agent-based technologies that are giving me asset information. And so, why do I need to talk to Axonius? Well, and the fact of the matter is that all of those methodologies produce a lot of great data, a wealth of data, but they also have holes in their methodology in terms of finding every asset or providing complete context to those assets, or even giving you kind of up to date information about those assets. And use a vulnerability scanner as an example. If you were to scan your entire network at a point in time and you don't do it again for 30 days, well, if there are devices that enter that network and in between those two scans, you're not going to know about them because you're not scanning, right? If the scanner is your source for asset information, you're also not going to see things like virtual machines or especially containers that spin up and go away. The average workload exists for about 6 to 8 hours in the cloud. So if you're not scanning when that workload comes up, if your scanner is your source and for finding assets, you're just not going to know about it from the scanner, right? Agent-based technologies, you don't always get the agent on everything that you manage, but even when you do, right, it's a singular point of view to the asset. It doesn't necessarily tell you all the other things that you might learn about that asset from some other data sources like the network, right? The router switch firewall is going to give you information about devices communicating through the network. You're going to know something about that asset from directory services. You're going to know something maybe a different viewpoint on that asset from your vulnerability scanner. So different data sources will give you more context. But more importantly, there are a bunch of devices. We've talked about them today: unmanaged devices, printers, copiers, TVs. I see Pelotons and Fitbits and all kinds of different devices, IoT devices in the network. You're never going to put an agent on those. They're unmanaged devices, and they're not going to run an agent. So your agent-based approach is going to have a hole or a gap in visibility. And so really it comes down to this idea that the only way to find every single asset is to aggregate all of your different data sources, because some devices will only exist, the presence of them, the evidence for the presence of them will only exist in one data source. Some elements of about the data, about the device, some of the characteristics of the device will only come from one data source. For example, open ports. You may only get open ports from your vulnerability scanner if you get a credential scan. You may only get the vulnerabilities from that vulnerability scanner, right? You may only know about users on the device. If, let's say, you don't get a credential scan, you may only know about users on the device from something like SCCM or Tanium. You will only know where that device is traversed through the network, potentially by having router, switch, firewall, or maybe some type of NAC source. So all of these elements become characteristics of a device. The more data sources you have, the more information that you have about a device, the more rich the context on the device.
Great. So we have time for one last question, and that is, why is the visibility Axonius provides better than the teams we have in place to oversee asset management in cybersecurity?
Well, I don't know the individual company that asked that question. I can't speak relative to you, but I'll tell you what we see often in the market, right? That is that Axonius, because we have so many different data connectors, we're able to plug into today. I think it's 300 and over 310 different technologies. We're building a new bridge or a new integration, what we call adapters, out to a new data source on average every 3 days. As I just spoke about, all of these data sources provide us with different context and information about devices. And so the more data sources we plug into, the more devices we find, the more we know about those. And there's something else very important about this. Trying to do this yourself and pulling it into a repository like a CMDB becomes very hard, because it's not just building the integrations or the bridges out to the data sources. That's actually one of the easiest parts. It's as you pull that information in, normalizing the data so that you can actually compare it. MAC address is not MAC address in every data source. The naming convention is not the same. One data source will call it a NIC, another will call it a physical adapter, another will call it a MAC address, and another might call it network interfaces. So there's a normalization layer to these data sources that you have to build and apply. So there's some science there. You have to maintain that every time one of those data sources changes. What you can pull from that data source, right? APIs change. As technology changes over time, you may pull different information out of the database. But then you have to correlate those devices. The more data sources you pull together, the more you have to understand from each data source where a particular device might reside. Use a laptop as an example. The laptop might have a record in AD. It may have a record in the firewall. For traversing through it. It may have a record in your vulnerability scanner. It may have several records in all of those different agent-based technology tools you have. And so when you pull all of these data sources together, you've got to be able to deduplicate those and understand that laptop from data source to data source is actually the same laptop. And that actually is a non-trivial exercise. That is extremely difficult, because there's collisions of data, big data, bad data, population into systems, no IEEE naming convention. So it becomes a very hard task. And so what I would say is, it might not be that it's our visibility, it's the ROI and cost model. Time to value inside of Axonius, because we've already built that for you, is very, very short, very low, the time to value, right? If you're trying to do it yourself, the time to value could be very high, and the total cost of ownership to manage and maintain that would also be high.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. And thanks again to our audience for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll follow up via email shortly. Like I mentioned, we recorded the webinar, so you'll get a copy in the next few hours. In the meantime, if you need anything or have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at anna@axonius.com and I'll get you to the right person. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.